I'm Robert Polito, Director of the New School Writing Program, and it's an immense pleasure to welcome you to this latest installment of our Legacy Conversations with Cave Canem. I want to thank all of our friends at Cave Canem, particularly Allison Meyer and Camille Rankin. And these legacy conversations are like nothing else that I know of in the literary world. They're where history and craft and the art all come together in one space. And we've all been looking forward to tonight's legacy conversation particularly because I think that we have not one but two legends really with us this evening. Steve Canem is, of course, an incredibly important poet and novelist and playwright. And so too, I think, is Tracie Morris. She's someone that I've come to know over the years in various ways. I think I first met her at an evening that we did with the Poetry Society of America a number of years ago. And she's one of the people, along with Steve, who's just helping keep the language alive. So please join me now in welcoming Camille Rankin, who will introduce the evening further. Camille.
Hi, everyone. My name is Camille Rankin. I'm the Program and Communications Coordinator for Cave Canem Foundation. And for those of you who don't know about Cave Canem, we're a national organization that's dedicated to cultivating the artistic and professional growth of African American poets. Since 1996, Cave Canem has been working to build a home for Black poetry in many sites across the country. We have a lot of wonderful programs coming up this fall in New York, including readings with Thomas Sayers Ellis, Rachel Eliza Griffiths, James Scully, Greg Pardlow, Indigo Moore, and many more talented poets. And we also have a fall benefit coming up on October 27th, which will feature performances by Cecil Taylor, Margot Jefferson, Randy Weston, the Tracie Morris Band, Jerry Allen, Mums and Aurora, and many more. So I hope that you'll be able to join us. It's going to be a great night. Tickets are starting at just $40. And you can find out more about the benefit and purchase tickets on our website, cavecanempoets.org. You can pick up information about our benefit and our other upcoming events at the back table right over there. We've got postcards, posters, program brochures, so I hope that you'll stop by and check us out. You can also sign up for our mailing list back there. And you can find out more about Cave Canem, what we're up to, and ways to support us at our website, cavecanempoets.org. So I'd like to start out by thanking Robert Polito, Lori Lynn Turner, and the New School for General Studies, as well as our funders, the New York Community Trust, Lila Atchison Wallace Fund for the Arts, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. We're very excited to be having Cave Canem's Legacy Conversation. The Legacy Conversation series was established in 2001, and it features preeminent poets and scholars who have played historic roles in African American poetry. Tonight, we're thrilled to be welcoming Steve Canem and Tracie Morris. Poet, playwright, and novelist Steve Canem is the author of the best-selling novel Groove, Bang, and Jive Around. In 1991, he converted a portion of his Lower East Side apartment into an informal salon that later became a gathering of the tribes, an arts and cultural organization dedicated to excellence in the arts from a diverse perspective. An institution in New York's multicultural artistic community since 1962, Mr. Canem continues to support innovative literary, musical, and artistic expression. Tracie Morris is an interdisciplinary poet who has worked extensively as a sound artist, writer, and multimedia performer. Her installations have been presented at the Whitney Biennial and the Jamaica Center for Arts and Learning. She has toured extensively throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia, and worked with an extensive range of artists. She's the author of 2 poetry collections, Intermission and Chap-T-her Woman. She is Associate Professor of English, Performance, and Media Studies at Pratt Institute. A Cave Canem graduate fellow, she served on the organization's board of directors 2002 to 2010. So we'll start out the evening with reading and conversation between Steve Canem and Tracie Morris, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And following the program, I hope that you'll join us for some refreshments as well. I don't want to speak any further. Please join me in welcoming Steve Canem and Tracie Morris.
The last time I heard David Hammons by Steve Canem, the first time I met David Hammons here in New York, he was running around on his bicycle. Last time he came by Tribes, he told me he was doing an installation in Vienna, which consisted of nothing but smells. I gave it some thought. Smells? When David and I first became buddies, he explained to me that he certainly did not have a large amount of money to produce work like the abstract expressionists, so his strategy in the art world was to go the route of art pro vero. Since I've known David over the last 25 to 30 years, bicycle and all, he's always found an inexpensive way to express his ideas through art. For example, take his ideas about basketball and his work titled Higher Goals, and or his works on American hairstyles, taking stone, wire, and human hair and calling it art, such as his work currently on exhibition at the Whitney, Spike Lee. Or better yet, take, for example, his body prints, in which he applies paint to his face, then presses a paper against his face and makes a print out of it. There's also his classic piece of Jesse Jackson adorning blonde hair and blue eyes. The caption reads, "How do you like me now?" But the last time David came to visit me here at Tribes, he told me about a wonderful idea he had for a show in Paris. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, David had been invited to do a show at Ace Gallery on the invitation of Douglas Christmas. David told me he was going to invite every blue chip artist in the country to be part of the show and that he would curate it, the likes of Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, etc. I attended the opening. The place was without lights and had a woman sitting at a computer and someone playing the cello. That was the show. 3 days later, David came by to tell me that the gallery owner was complaining because he was losing $25,000 a day. David's answer, of course, was, he can afford it. But what really blew my mind was when David came by and told me about the show he had in Paris. He and 14 other artists were invited by the city of Paris to produce public installations. When asked what his piece would be, David said he would be doing a rainbow. By the time the show opened, David was back in Brooklyn. The curator called up and asked what had happened to the rainbow. David answered, "It's coming soon, don't worry about it." But what really blew my mind was when David came by talking about his installation of smells. He decided, mind you, that all he needed was a hall. He would do an installation in an enclosed space, and when the audience walked in, they would sense a scent. But he never told me what the smell would be. A month later, he came by Tribes and gave me a disc. I said, "David, what is this?" He said, "That's the smell." The only thing I know about Mr. Hammonds and his art, since he believes in making something out of nothing, his whole thing is to stay one step ahead of in the art game, one step ahead of the art game. Always has been, and as far as I can tell, it always will be. As they, in parlance, you pay to play. Steve Canem, Director of Gathering of the Tribes. So there's a lot in that essay, Steve. There's a whole lot. It says a lot about David, and I think it says a lot about you. I have to say that I had an opportunity to actually meet David Hammond because I was hanging out at Tribes when I was in Japan and saw one of his installations that was subsequently banned, where he had these insects self-deconstruct an African mask, an African sculpture that was wood, and use this termite dust in these very small figurines placed around the gallery to make a comment. I don't dare to assume what David Hammond was doing. But what I got from it was the deconstruction of art, and especially the deconstruction of African art in a hyper-modern society. And then we had dinner and drinks with a whole bunch of folks, and I just thought, wow, this is a really interesting experience to be in Japan meeting a world-renowned artist because I was hanging out at the Lower East Side for a time. Steve did not allow me to do like I'm like, you're the legacy. I'm just like some little knucklehead new kid from Brooklyn, some hick from East New York. But he said that I cannot do a simple Q&A, so I'm going to try to interject some conversation here. But I would prefer to just like listen to Steve talk about stuff. So I'm going to try to act like I'm having a conversation, but really just make Steve talk. Since you chose that as the work of yours for me to read rather than Groove Bang, or one of your plays that I brought from ages ago, Now What Now, which I might sneak in a couple of words from. What made you write that article? Why did you frame David Hammond in terms of the senses in that way?
Well, it's a funny incident. What happened is that Jack Tilton, who's one of the agents, David's dealers. I'm always invited to the openings when Jack has an opening. So I was up at the opening up at this gallery, and I was talking to Jack's wife, Connie, and she told me they were doing a book on artists out in California, out in the Los Angeles area, and it covered the period when David was one of the artists out in California. And I mentioned to her that the only time I ever knew David was when he first came to New York City. So she turned to me and she said, gee, she said, why don't you write something about, your experience with him here in New York City? And what David does constantly, the only time he makes it a point to come by tries when he knows no one else is there but me. And if other people are there, he leaves. He comes late at night. So every time he does a new show or is thinking about doing a show or being invited to do a show, he comes over and runs the idea past me. So I started thinking about the most ridiculous things that David had done. And the first thing that came in my mind was this damn show about smells. And I have yet to ask him what the smell was because I was scared. So I put together an article reminiscing about David for that book they're going to publish out in California. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing about it, Tracy, is that after I wrote it, I emailed it to Connie and Jack, and she says to me right away, she said, "Well, you sent it to David." I said, "Oops." So I sent it to David. Next thing I know, the phone rings. I hadn't heard from David for a whole month. I say, and he says, I said, what do you think about the article? He says, take that thing out there about Arts Pavero. I say, why? He says, because out there in California, I never even heard of that term. But he liked it.
Oh, good. Well, actually, one of the first installations of David's that I saw was at your house. This is actually really interesting. Mr. Hammond made this kind of, wire, and what was that, the balls made of, the material that the balls were made of? The blue sculpture?
Oh, yeah, I remember that, but I can't remember the exact material you did.
Well, it was this really interesting wire and other materials, which I don't know, but it looked kind of a little bit fuzzy. My memory isn't fuzzy. Art piece, and it was above Steve's couch. And
I got a funny story to tell you about that piece. You aren't going to believe it.
All right. Well, I just want to say one thing about it, and then I want to turn to Steve's story. And I think this conversation is actually a metaphor for Steve's relationship with community and the art community in particular. But one day I went by, and Steve, the house, the place had been painted. Steve been living there for a long time, so it's like painted. And I remember you saying, "Oh, David's really bad." And I was like, "Why is David bad? Because you painted it?" He said, "Because that color does not go with his sculpture." I remember that. I think the wall was white before, and then it was another color, and he was just like, I didn't put that there for that color. And he was a little upset about that. So what were you going to say about him?
No, what happened is that I had been another piece there behind the couch, and David would come over, and he hated that piece, and it was done by an artist. What it was a piece of Avenue C on a Saturday night, and with what do you call it, night lights and all that. But it was poorly drawn, poorly executed. And David would come and stare at that piece. And finally, one night he came in and started ripping this guy's artist off the wall. And says, "I hate this. You got to take this off this wall." So he took it off. Next thing I know, he came for 4 solid nights and painted that piece you love so much. And what happened, everybody fell in love with it. Tish Benson came there one day because we were talking about publishing her book. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the conversation, Tish just stopped talking to me, and she's yelled and screamed and said, "What is that behind you?" I said, "That's a piece by David Hammond." She said, "It looks like something that was done by Prince. It's called Jammin'. I'm going to name it Jammin'." She fell in love with that piece. And meanwhile, what happened is that Tracie did some dough. And so I decided, I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this damn thing on the market. So I called up Jack, I called up some dealers and blah, blah, blah. And some of them made me offers, and the offers weren't enough, so I kept getting pissed off at them. And finally someone came in, with $100,000 a frame. So I went and, let them have it. And it was so funny, because after I sold it, it's still on the wall. So all these artists would come back and buy the house, and we're trying to figure out how the hell are you going to sell something that's still on the wall. I say, well, if you know anything about art, they have a very sophisticated way of doing that. And they were scratching their heads and couldn't figure it out. The young lady who bought it for me was another one of David's dealers. She came in and she looked at the piece, and she brought this restorer with her, some German guy, and she asked him, his name was Christian. She says, Christian, can you reproduce it? He looked at it about a half an hour, brought in a photographer, they reproduced the piece, and sold it to they built a chapel for it in Greece, of all places, Tracy,
What?
and sold that piece for $1.5 million. And then they called me up, this is the funny part, they told me that the collector was having a show in London, and they needed proof that David had done it, because I had a couple of people take photographs of David was making a piece as proof. I said, well, what do you need proof of? He said, the collector's going to have a show in London of his collection, and David's piece is going to be in there. I said, well, make sure you put the name of Canem Tracie there. It originated with us. Give us some publicity.
Well, you know, these anecdotes are really kind of amazing because they make me think about your relationship with the community, with various intersecting communities, including one that's not really talked about as much, which is the Black Bohemian community in the Lower East Side, and the intersecting artists in that community. I mean, I wanted to ask you about.
Well, I got some funny stories to tell you about some of those characters.
Well, I am sure you do. I kind of want to know, before we get into some of the anecdotes about individuals, though, how do you think that community formed? What do you think its significance was in the 1960s? And then I want to know a little bit about your biography, your history, when you came to New York and things like that. But first, tell me a little bit about this community that kind of formed and some of the people in it.
Okay, well, the way the whole happened is that, you know, we came from all over the States and elsewhere, and God knows, you know, the Caribbean, Latin America, all over the United States, North and South, and from Europe and every damn place. And what happened, a lot of us was hanging out over near NYU, you know, over in Greenwich Village. And, you know, because the clubs was over the jazz clubs, and, you know, there was a scene over there for poetry and music and blah, blah, blah. To give you an idea when that was when, you know, John Coltrane and Miles was kicking, and when that whole, you know, folk music thing first got off the ground and all that kind of stuff, you know, Folk City, places like that. And so what happened, a whole group of us, it seemed to happen gradually, then suddenly, ended up all on the Lower East Side. And the reason we moved over there, because I'm embarrassed to tell you how cheap the rent was. When I tell people nowadays, Tracy, they have a heart attack. You get a floor like I'm on right now back in those days for $35 a month. You know, can you imagine doing that nowadays?
You can't even get a sandwich in that neighborhood for $35 a month. Sandwich and a cup of coffee, $50. If you're going to spend $40, spend it on the Cave Canem benefit.
Right. I'm with you on that. So anyway, so what happened, a whole bunch of us moved over there, and we had three places. I was thinking about that when you called the other day. We had one bar called Stanley's. That's where all the painters and writers and musicians would hang out, just to shuck and jive. They had another place down the street on 3rd Street, right across from where the New York Poets Cafe is now, called the Old Reliable, and that's where we would go and, you know, dance and sing and carry on. And across the street from there was Slugs, a jazz club. And that's where Lee Morgan got assassinated, as you know, and that's where we were going to hear music. And then later the electric circles opened up, and that's when Sly and Patrick Stone used to perform there. And Fillmore East opened up, and that's when Miles and Ornette and Coltrane, Laura Neal, and all those people performed at you know, what do you call it, the Fillmore East. Now, who was around at that time? Ishmael had just blown in from Buffalo. I met him when he first came to town, and he and I became big-time buddies, and we started a publishing company back in the 60s together to publish young writers, the same thing I do now. And then a whole bunch of other people was on the scene. I met Barack when I first came to town. Of course, I still call him Leroy Jones. He gets upset with me, but I know him as Leroy Jones. But anyway, so what happened? Roy was published in a little magazine called Eugene at that time, which had come up about once when they had money, like Tribes come up when they had some money. about young writers down in that neighborhood. He published one anthology, a book of short stories called The Moderns. And we started an organization because this is back in the 60s, and the civil rights movement and black power and integration and everything else was hot and heavy. And Malcolm was on the scene, and Martin Luther King was on the scene, blah, blah, blah. So we figured we had to do something too. We couldn't just sit on the Lower East Side and be artists. We had to participate on some level. So we founded an organization called Organization Young Men. And we would meet every Sunday, and all those meetings ended up being, Tracy, it's just a big complaint session. We would just sit there and complain about how we were being mistreated and abused, about the power structure, blah, blah, blah. But the organization never did anything, because a bunch of damn musicians and painters and poets and things like that. So Archie Shepherd would go and play his music, so we go and hear Archie play, Cecil would play his music, we would go and hear Cecil play, the poets, and we would go and read their poets, so we would go to the poetry reading, blah, blah, blah. And all we did on Sunday was just sit around and complain. so that got to be pretty old. And then what happened as time moved on is that we started an organization. Oh, no, we didn't start an organization. Ishmael and I decided that since we had a few dollars, that we started our own publishing company. I'm embarrassed today how much money we started the publishing company from. I think Ishmael was working at the hospital as a what do you call it? Assistant, you know, for clean out bedpans, whatever you do during the hospital.
Nurse's aide or
Yeah, nurse's aide. And I can't remember. I think I was working for some printing company at the time. And we got a little income tax return, you know. I think I got about $2,000 this year. I got $2,000. And we took that little money and published our first book of poetry. No, fiction. It wasn't our book. Someone else, a young writer, we published them. You know, just an investment because we believed in young writers and stuff. And that's how we started out. And then what happened is that Ishmael got a contract, published his first novel. And after that, his Doubleday wanted him to do an anthology. So, you know, he started around trying to figure out who in the hell to put in an anthology, this writer, that writer, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, he took part of the groove bang and Jive Around and putting in a whole bunch of other stuff. And meanwhile, Baraka was going through all kinds of crazy stuff because he was living with Hetty at that time before he moved up to Harlem and then eventually over to Jersey. And the person that stuck in my mind when you called the other night and said, let's talk about the 60s, was Larry Neal. Larry Neal was an extremely brilliant, intelligent young man, knew everything he was to know about literature, very articulate, and, you know, a very positive person. And what happened is that all the poets, the Afro-American poets who was downtown, including the painters, including the musicians, when Roy and the crowd went uptown, up to Harlem, and started something called the Black Arts Movement, it was funny as all hell, because they didn't know a damn person up in Harlem. So every time they did an event, they had to come downtown to get the poets, get the musicians, and get the artists, and take them uptown to do events up there. And finally, they put out an anthology, you know, on black poets, and then Roy, that got pretty heavy at the time, so they jumped ship and they moved to New Jersey. But who was coming on the scene at that time? When they came over to where I'm living right now, was the Black Panthers, because what happened, some of those guys were living down the Lower East Side anyway, and every time I would see them, they would tell me about how, you know, how you had to get your gun because the revolution is going to start. You know, you got to get armed, brother. You know, get your gun, man. The revolution's on its way, blah, blah, blah. And next thing I know, you know, they got chased out of uptown, and they came back hiding down the Lower East Side. In fact, Tracy, when you called the other night, I started thinking about all that 60s stuff in the downtown, seeing the artists and blah, blah, blah. You know who was down there? Tupac Shakur's mother lived on the Lower East Side. You know, she was down there for a while. And, you know, Charles Squire, he was a guy by the name of C, he was down there. So I knew a lot of those Panthers at the same time down there, you know. In fact, Norman just interviewed John Parrish yesterday. He's got a book of poetry, a book of fiction out. Oh, okay. Would you believe that John Parrish was Malcolm X's bodyguard, and he was there when Malcolm got assassinated? Oh, I didn't know. Wow. I asked Norman, I said, what did you ask Norman about? Then asked John what happened when you were in the Audubon ballroom when Malcolm got assassinated. And John told Norman, I guess we made a mistake.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Steve, one thing I know is one of Steve's particular effects is he always laughs. He's always laughing. And I don't think I don't think it's a jolly laugh, in my opinion. You know, just hearing you talk about tragic, extraordinary events like the assassination of Malcolm X with the same kind of aplomb as discussing David Hammond being one step ahead of the art world. And I just think it's an interesting gesture and use of language, humor to talk about or to indicate the kind of really interesting upside down world we live in. There's so much to ask you just based on those few, you know, you're just throwing names left and right. I'm just like, oh my God, I was ask you. Can we just spend an hour talking about Amiri going from Lower East Side to Uptown? Or can we just spend an hour talking about the 14 people that you've mentioned, or, you know, that you've known for more than 30 years?
Right.
So it's kind of like, it's a really difficult choice, but, you know, feel free to divert from some of my questions. I guess maybe I wanted to ask you next about Umbra and how that developed, and if you could tell people a little bit about it.
Oh, that's another funny story. Because what happened, I decided, I was a young writer. I must say, I don't even know how old I was, Tracy. I must have been about 24, 25 years old. And I was new to a lot of those guys downtown because I had moved over, you know, from the west side to the east side. Mm-hmm. And I was just getting to know everybody who was on the scene, the artists, the painters, and blah, blah, blah. And who I had made friends with at that time was Ishmael Reed. And Ishmael had just come to the Lower East Side from Buffalo. And what he had done out there, he worked for the newspaper, you know. And he was all hot and heavy and trying to get into the poetry scene, blah, blah, blah. So him and Tom Dent and David Henderson, and they started something called an Umbra Workshop, similar to what you and I and Bob was all about, you know, back during the days of the Stoop. Mm. But, you know, this is way back in the 60s. So they would have meetings every Friday and, you know, work on their poetry, blah, blah, blah. Now, you got to remember, you know, the politics was hot and heavy. I mean, seriously. And you had to be politically correct. And if you said something wrong, someone might bash your head in. So at the workshops, instead of talking about poetry, they'd be kicking each other's ass and fighting and carrying on. And they was always coming over to where I was living. I used to live on 4th Street before I bought that house. And they would come over and tell me all the things that went on at the workshop. And then after they finished telling me, you ought to join, Steve. I said, I'm not going to come over there and get no fights with you guys. Y'all must be crazy. And they'd be over there arguing with each other. And what happened is that who had come with the idea was Tom. Tom then came with the idea. Ishmael brought David Henderson by my house. That's the first time I ever met David. And then through the years, you know, all three of us became great friends. Tom ended up going back down to New Orleans and starting that New Orleans Jazz Festival. And then David went out to California. Of course, Ish went out there to teach. But the purpose of Umbra is similar to Tribes and similar to what you guys are doing in Cave Canem, you know, was to encourage young writers. You know, in other words, they didn't just find a magazine for themselves, but also to encourage young writers and expand and things like that. Mm-hmm. They ended up doing about 4 issues, but the politics got heavy. And the funny thing about the politics, someone, I can't remember that guy's name, from Cleveland or somewhere, he wrote a poem which forecast Kennedy's assassination about 6 months before it happened. And this was before Malcolm said chickens coming home to roost. Anyway, so what happened, they got in an argument about the poem. Half of them wanted to put the poem in, the other half didn't want to didn't want to publish the poem, and it tore Umbra apart. Mm. That's what caused its demise at that time. Mm. But David and I remained friends. Barack and that crowd, as I told you, moved up to Harlem and then to Queen. I mean, out to where he lives in Newark. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, is that by this time it had gotten so heavy, they had put down the word and picked up the gun. It was threatening each other's life. That's how nuts they were. Because if your politics didn't agree with the other person's politics, your butt was in trouble. You know. So what happened is that we all we remained friends over the years, and of course everybody went on and did their own thing. David ended up writing that brilliant biography on Jimi Hendrix. Ishmael went and did some stuff out there in California and continued to write. And I stayed in New York and wrote that dirty, filthy book, Groove Banging Jive Around, which is still an underground bestseller.
Well, you know, I asked you a couple questions about the contemporary scene that you developed, cultivated on the Lower East Side. Where are you from? How you get there?
Oh, that's a long, long, long story, but I'll keep it short. I'm from New Orleans originally. And what can I tell you about growing up in New Orleans? You know all about that town. My father, well, he didn't leave the plant until he got to be about 90 years old. But they were from a plantation right outside of New Orleans where they had that big oil spill called Blackman Parish. And out there was a rice plantation. So his father had grown up my grandfather grown up in a rice plantation. On my mother's side, my mother died when I was 2 months old, so I got all these stories from my grandmother. Her family was from a sugar plantation on the other side of the city, and they met in New Orleans. So the whole family, all my sisters and brothers, in fact, I just talked to my sister today before I came here. I got 12 sisters and brothers. They're all older than me, and would you leave lucky for me, they all still alive.
Wow.
They all got kids, and their kids got kids. And every time I talked to them, all they wanted to do is talk to me about New Orleans, what's changed down there, what's different, and about that flood and that oil spill down there. But what happened is that I went and traveled all over. I went to England, I went to France, I went to Germany. Where else did I go? I went down to Panama. I forgot where else I went. And growing up in New Orleans, the first thing you do in New Orleans is that you get soaked in by that music. So, you know, I was hearing that music all over the place, you know, and I grew up with Wynton Marsalis' father, Ellis. And, you know, I used to go and hear music all the time down there. So everywhere I went, all I wanted to do was hear the music, hear the music, hear the music. But my sisters and brothers, thank God, are some wonderful people. I was the baby, but all I remember about them, Tracy, is that they loved to read. Oh, they would read every damn thing they could get their hands on. They read all the Langston stuff and, you know, gone all the way back, you know, to early poetry, Afro-American poetry, all that stuff, James Weldon Johnson stuff, and blah, blah, blah. And they were funny kids, because I remember I was about 5 or 6 years old. What they would do, they would come home from school, and they'd throw their books on the couch, or on the chair, or wherever it is. And then on Sunday, because my father would you know, get on our case all the time, and he would make us tell stories and sit around and talk about what we've been doing in school. And they would always be telling stories about these wonderful books they were reading and how excited they were about it. So when they would throw the books on a chair, I'll pick it up and try and read it because I wanted to be in a part of the conversation too.
Wow.
And then what happened, my grandmother on my father's side, is that, you know, after my mother passed away and we were all growing up, I was raised by my grandmother. What she used to do, she would make us all come to her house. Well, I was living with her, but she would make my other sister and brother come to her house once a month on a Sunday. And this is the days before television, and, you know, all you had was the radio. And she would cook this big meal, and after she cooked the meal, she would turn off the radio. Our job, would you believe it, Tracy? We all had to get up there and tell a story or recite a poem.
Oh.
That's where that started with her. So when I left New Orleans and gone traveling all over, and came for me to come back to New York, and you know, I met so many exciting people in this country and that country, and I was always wanted to be around writers, musicians, and artists because I found them to be very interesting people, and I had aspirations of wanting to write myself, but I was scared. Anyway, I mean, I didn't have the courage. So what happened is that when it came back to come to the States, I said to myself, and this is during the days of desegregation in the South. So this is getting pretty heavy down there with, you know, Emmett Till and all that stuff that was happening down there. I said, well, do I really want to go back down south to get shot by one of them crackers from Mississippi? You know, I don't know. I don't think so. So I said, well, the best thing for me to do is, you know, stay in New York City. So when I came back, you know, I came to New York. I lived up in Harlem with 2 students from NYU for a while. They got thrown out of their damn apartments. And they were funny guys because they had been sent up to New York because they had been in the civil rights movement down south, and they had made a deal that if they got arrested and thrown in jail, they were college students down south, if they got arrested and thrown in jail, the organization, I think it was CORE, or the what do you know, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is that don't worry about it. We will pay for you for a 4-year scholarship up at NYU. And that's how they got transferred to go to school of art. One guy was an artist, the other guy was in business. So I moved in with them, and we moved downtown, down on Clinton Street together. And then, that's how I met all those people. But in answer to your question, where I came to New York from, I came to New York directly from England. But who I wanted to be around, I wanted to be around a bunch of, artists, poets, musicians. And lucky for me, I ran right into those people, and I've been happy ever since.
And you
I won't have it any other way.
Wow. You said that you spent some time in Panama, England, and France, and in Paris is where you went to school, right?
No, I went to school in England. What happened, oh God, where did I go to school? I left New Orleans when I was 17, and I went to school up in, of all places, University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and that's where the school was located. That was the first time I ever seen the Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis. And to give you an idea when that was, I looked up in the sky one night, and there was Sputnik going over the sky.
Wow.
I thought, this is a damn miracle. But what happened, I traveled to those places, and then the way I ended up in England, I decided, I wanted to see, that neck of the woods because I heard so much about Europe, but the hell did I know about Europe? And what happened is I ended up, and for some reason I became interested in the damn depression. I can figure out what it calls depression. I know now. But anyway, is that I became first interested in Afro-American history. So I read every damn thing I could on Afro-American history, every damn book. I used to spend all kinds of time in every library digging around for this, digging around for that. And, reading Richard Wright, Chester Himes, and James Baldwin and people like that, and going all the way back to Langston, even before that. That Harlem Renaissance stuff and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so when I was in England, I decided that, I should, I take a course in world history. And so I got fascinated with that because I've always been interested in history, so I went to London School of Economics. And then when it came time for me to come back, I came in, that way. But I had visited in Panama, and I was down in Nicaragua. That's the furthest south I've been. And
so did you finish school there, or did you just stay there to do some research
yeah,
and come back?
over there, But,
you said you went to the Sorbonne for a while?
I went over there, and what I did over there, not too long ago, we went to a big writers' conference over there on Richard Wright, Chester Himes, and James Baldwin. But, I had met James Baldwin here in New York City, years earlier,
Okay. Well, I stand corrected, London School of Economics instead of Sorbonne, which I thought. All right. Wow. Would you be terribly upset if I read some of Groove Bang?
Read some of what?
Groove Bang.
Well, I mean, did Tracy tell you guys the story what she did when that magazine came out, or that book came out?
I don't want to talk about my story.
I want to tell you the story because it's a wonderful story. Tracy and I know this insane poet who's totally out of his mind. He thinks he's the baddest, most hippest, and serious cat you ever want to meet in your life. And his name is Darius James. I met Darius years ago when he first came to New York, and Darius wrote this book called Negrophobia, and I was telling him a story about back in the days, this show and me, blah, 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 and I told him I'd written this daring novel called Groove Bang and Jive Around. So Darius is the one who got that damn thing republished. The damn book was dead for 10 years. He found the publisher and got it republished for me. And Tracy was running the scene over at St. Mark's Church. Her and Darius got together, and they sat down and they had 20 points to read that whole damn book.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Now, I have to tell you, Groove Bang is not for the faint of heart. It is a satirical pornographic novel. I mean, it's not a euphemism.
I call it a dirty book. I call it a nasty book.
It's a dirty, nasty book. Now, you might say, well, really? But, you know.
My older sister read that book and she couldn't sit down for a week.
Oh, my God. I don't even know what that means. I'm very afraid to ask that question. I'm punk.
She had to read that book standing up.
Oh, my God. I'm just trying to figure out what can I read in this book.
Well, you better find a part that's going to keep it clean.
All right, I'm just going to read, you know, we run into trouble fairly quickly, so I'm just going to read the first couple paragraphs. The Gumbo House. Let me see, anything? I think you get a little bit of the flavor here without me going into, you know, getting too deep. The Gumbo House. It was already late, half past the cat's ass and getting later. 10 back of 12, and still Annette was with her little young 14-year-old self wasn't home, but she didn't care. She stepped up to the jukebox, dropped 2 bits in the slot, and pressed J10. The bright hues on the electronic juke changed colors as the record spun, and a pulse selected her number. She sensed the eyes of every male in the Gumbo House x-raying her well-stacked ass through the green miniskirt and black panties, down to her soft brown thighs and round hairless legs and sandaled feet. The babe was dynamite and knew it. Stop right there. It gets a little deeper. Now, I thought I was prepared, you know, somewhat for this book when I read Negrophobia, but seeing the source of inspiration for Negrophobia, it was quite deep. And I guess one of the questions I never got to ask you, even though I was really happy when the book came out and we did have the book party, which was packed. It was, I mean, I was running like the Monday night series at the Poetry Project, which is like 14 people come, and on a good night when we have the open house, it's like 25 people, and they all read forever and take a poem. But when we did this thing, it was bedlam. I mean, it was hundreds of people there, and they all could not wait to read this very, it's a celebration of Steve and a celebration of his writing acumen, to read this really filthy, transgressive, troublemaking, dirty book, as he put it. So what on earth made you write this book that your sister literally could not sit down? I don't know what that means. One of your siblings, one of your 12 siblings.
Yeah, my older sister, that girl couldn't sit down. They kept calling me up in the office and told me she had read that book. I didn't even want the family to read that damn thing.
Yeah, well, actually, I had I was teaching a class on transgressive literature at Sarah Lawrence, and one of my students was hanging out on the Lower East Side, and I said, "Have you?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, I want to know about Steve Cannon." I said, "Well, have you read his book?" And she said no. So I had her read Darius James, this book, and compare it with some things like Clockwork Orange and these other kind of pushing the envelope kind of genres. What made you write Groove Bang and write it in this way?
Well, here's what happened. There's a great writer who some of you guys might know about, might not know about. His name is Clarence Major. Clarence is a damn good poet, Afro-American poet from Chicago. He was part of the crowd who was hanging out with us down with Ishmael and David and those people back in the 60s. And Clarence, he used to come over and we used to talk about literature all the time. What do you think about this writer? Did you read that writer? Blah, blah, blah. You know what writers talk about among themselves. Something like musicians talk about musicians to each other. So anyway, Clarence ran into the house one night. He said, "Guess what, Steve?" I said, "What?" He said, I just got a contract to publish this novel." I said, "Oh, no kidding." I said, "Who gave you the contract?" He said, "Blah, blah, blah." I said, "Well, congratulations." And then I started thinking about it, and I had read some of Clarence's work, and I liked his work, and blah, 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 blah. I said, "Well, damn." I said, Clarence, I said to myself, Clarence is being pretty damn selfish. I said, he's going to tell me about it. He's got a publisher. And the least he can do is introduce me to the publisher, because maybe I got something in mind I want to write too, darn it. So the next time Clarence came out of the house, I said, "Man," I said, "why don't you tell me about that publisher?" So Clarence said, "Well, man, I didn't know you were interested. Here's his number, and give him a call." So I gave Gerodis a call. By the way, he was the same guy who had published Chester Himes and Henry Miller over in Paris. So I read all that stuff anyway, so I knew exactly where Gerodis was coming from. So I went on and had a meeting with him, and Gerodis said, "Well, look," he said, "Steve, all you got to do He said, you write one chapter and give me an outline. I'll read it and decide whether or not we will publish it. Because I want to see one chapter and see, if you got a good writing style and see what and give me an outline, and then we'll go from there. So I sat down, Tracy, and I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. Now, Neverkov had done Lolita. I said, well, I read Lolita way back in the 50s, and by that time, I think they made 2 movies of Lolita. I said, well, I'm gonna have to get me a young heroine in this book, so let me think about someone who's 14. So I decided to, based on that young lady, and I read Barbarella, so I read all that kind of stuff. So I decided to write a pornographic protest Afro-American novel. You talk about all the contradictions of American society and just have some fun. That's how that came about.
That's fascinating. I did not know that was the inspiration for this book. I think I was kind of afraid to ask him what the inspiration was for the book. Maybe that's why I'm happy to know. Anyway, I was a punk back then.
Right.
That's really fascinating. That's really, and the thing about that scene that you said you were kind of born into this culture that people don't, I think, talk about enough, not to be too corny about it.
Right.
But like the really rich tradition of black literary tradition, not just oral tradition, but same thing. When I was a kid, I had to put on shows. You had to read a lot. You had to know, you had to have read, certain things in the house. And I think sometimes we assume that there's this. Well, I think the stereotype generally is that you have these black communities that are sort of rich in African American manifestations or responses to American culture, but not that people just like classical literature, like classical music, like all these things, and then just sort of in addition to that, had something that was an alternative to it, that was an organic part of that community, in a lot of ways preceded some of that. So I'm happy that you talked about it, because I think one of the stereotypes about black bohemia and black bohemian artists is that they're fish out of water and they don't really belong any place, and so they're caught between these two worlds. It's like, no, they come from specific worlds and they're very known in the black community.
Right.
Which actually reminds me, and this is such a great opportunity to talk to you about things that you have said to me over and over the years, and some of them you probably don't remember because you have so many amazing stories and people that you know. My little knucklehead questions maybe didn't come up much, but I remember when there was a celebration of John Michel Basquiat's life, not too soon after he died. There was a Whitney retrospective, and then a lot of the downtown artists said, well, we want to do something for John that's not uptown, so what's up with that? And then we had some readings at the New Eurekan, which were
I remember that.
very intense. I mean, John Michel had definitely shown up. The lights were literally blowing out as we were reading. It was a very intense experience.
Right.
But I remember one thing that you said about John Michel, and I don't know if you still feel this way, but you said the way that you casually said, well, the problem with John Michel. He said, he got caught up in this other world and he lost contact with his people.
Well,
I never forgot that.
Someone came over to Tracy the other day. Unfortunately, I don't get around as much as I used to, especially when it comes to seeing movies and blah, blah, blah. But someone was over at the house the other day, and they told me they just did a documentary on Jean Michel. And they gave me a summary of the documentary, and I was trying to get someone to write a critique of it for the website, but I haven't been so fortunate. But if you go back and look at that guy's life, he went to that free school over in Brooklyn. His father was, very high in the Haitian American community over there. And Jean Michel, decided he wanted to hang out in Greenwich Village and Soho and blah, blah, blah. He used to run around putting up the little signs saying same old, same old, same old, meaning same old shit. And then, he's desperate to get into the art world. And he got caught up in it and started making that art and blah, blah, blah. But the only problem with it, because I remember both those things, I certainly do remember the show at the cafe, and I remember that mini retrospective did his work up at the Whitney Museum, because I remember they wanted me to do something, and I got pissed off. So what I did is that I called up every person who had anything to Jean-Michel's career from the time he ran away from home to the time he's, his demise, all his dealers, all his friends, and blah, blah, blah. And I put together a play, which I call, what do you call it, Al Courant, and which was the last day of his day on the planet Earth, about him ordaining and all that kind of stuff. And what I did in the play, I showed how the art world, I demonstrated in the play how he had been used by the art world. The biggest problem he had, contrary to people like David Hammons, other artists. I went up to the Whitney Museum today, and because I remember one of the first few artists I met when I came to Lower East Side was Romare Bearden. And of course, Romare was old, and I met Norman Lewis at the same time. But those guys, experienced, and to talk to them about art, I mean, they knew all the corruption and everything else about the art world, and certainly knew where they were standing. And the problem with Jean-Michel, he didn't have that mentorship. In other words, have people older than you and say, do this and don't do that, do this and don't do that, do this and don't do that. So every chance, everything that came his way, he went with it. I was talking to David yesterday. Unfortunately, I didn't mean to bring him up again, but Mary Chin and I was coming down in the cab, and I was telling how funny it was. Someone called me up, and they wanted to give David a show at the Pompidou Museum over in Paris. He turned him down. But Jean-Michel was the guy, whoever you offered him a show, he wasn't to the point where he can turn people down. He accepted everything. And then he got sucked into those drugs, and that was about it. And he kicked a habit. His father found out about him, took him out to California, took him to Hawaii. He kicked a habit, and would you believe, no sooner he got back from Hawaii, clean as a whistle, he went to that studio over in Great Jones Street, bam, and that was it, and it took him 2 days to find that body. I was so upset when that stuff happened. I was pissed, because there was no reason. And what's make it so sad, just like I know that little kid was so talented, so ambitious, had all that passion. If he was about 50 years old now, he would be kicking ass something awful, And he didn't get a chance to develop into that. That's what I got upset about more than anything else,
There's another person that I remember you talking about extensively before he passed that also visited you a lot on the Lower East Side, and that you kept up a relationship with until his passing, which was Miles Davis.
Yeah. Oh, Miles was a trip. That guy was funny as all hell, But he played the hell out of the damn trumpet, because what happened, Quincy got that damn contract. It was so funny. And because what had happened, Baraka had written a piece on Miles the year before for Jazz, Newport Jazz Festival. And for some reason, Miles didn't take a liking to Baraka. I don't know why. And then the following year, the New York Magazine asked Quincy to write the piece. So he wrote a profile on Miles in the New York Magazine, the New York Times Magazine. So next thing I know, Quincy used to come down to the house every Saturday and chat about every damn thing under the sun. So he runs into the house, he says, guess what, Steve? I say, what? He said, man, I talked to Miles. Miles wanted me to do this biography. I know shit. I said, this is great. For the next 10 years, Tracy, every time I see Quincy, he's telling me Miles Davis stories. It got to the point I used to call Quincy Little Miles. I said, here come Little Miles, here come Little Miles. Little Miles say his story, here come Little Miles, And as soon as he hit the door, the first thing Quincy would say, you know what Miles said today? Know what Miles said today? Damn, man. But I remember one time I used to go to the Vanguard all the time. Whenever Miles was playing over there, this is after the train jumped ship and had his own group. And Wayne was playing, Herbie Hancock, that crowd, and Tony Williams was playing drums. And somebody came out, I was saying, man, Miles is playing with the Vanguard. So I jumped in the cab, went over to the Vanguard, and I caught the end of the second set, and they were coming off the stage when I walked in. And they'd break, and I was sitting there having a drink, and Miles was sitting at the bar in the Vanguard, and he's sitting there talking to Cicely Tyson. I ran up to Miles. I said, "Say, man, I want to hear Kind of Blue. Did you play it?" Miles looked at me and said, "Yeah, man, I played it. Didn't you hear it?" And I thought about it, And then I didn't realize what he said until I got back to my apartment over in Lower East Side. He meant, did I hear the record?
Oh, man.
That was his idea of humor. I played it, did you hear it?
Well, you have a similar, I remember you saying a few things like that yourself. So did you guys remain friends, or was that the only?
No, we would see each other from time to time, you know. And because he would come down to Slugs, and Slugs was there too. Because that was about time Bitches Brew came out, and those albums came out. And what Miles got in the habit of doing, anytime he would do a new album, and he would have some, new ideas, he'd go and get himself some new musicians. He wouldn't use the same people all the time. But the way he would get the new musicians, Tracy, he would go around the scene and see who's kicking ass, who's playing where, and what they're doing. And if you like what they're doing, that's like Branford Marcellus in there playing with him. So he would go around all the clubs and just listen, And if he hear something good, he'd say, man, you play my band, I got this album coming out, I want you to play. So one night he's sitting in what do you call it, in Slugs, and these cats, he got all these musicians they got in Slugs trying to get a play, blah, blah, blah. And the word went around that Miles was in Slugs. They started whispering, hey man, Miles is at the, sitting over at the corner. You see Miles over there? This fool ran over to Miles, talking about, hey, Mr. Davis, I'm a composer. I play jazz. I just wrote this score. I want to show you the score. Miles slammed down the bar, slammed his fist down the bar, and the guy telling Miles he wanted him to see his arrangement. Miles slammed down the corner of the bar, jumped up from his seat, ran out the place, and told the musician, you need to be arranged. That kind of character, that's who he was.
I want to read an excerpt from a play that you wrote called Now What Now? Act 1, Scene 1, Loss. And I want you to tell me a little bit about this.
I'll give you the background on that too.
Okay, all right. You don't know me. Her. You don't know me. Him. Yes, I do. Her, but you're the one who brought it up. Him. I never said a word. Her. Who are you anyway? Him. Don't you know? Her. Well, Larry, you're out of here. Him. If you try this one on me, Marge, you'll pay. Her. Yeah, but you're forgetting one thing. Him. What am I forgetting? Her. I own this place. Him. Means nothing to me. Her. Then I'm sure you won't mind packing up and going. Him. Look at it this way, Marge. Her. Look at it what way? Him. It is you who started this. Her. Started what? Him. You guessed it. Her. What? Scene 2, your wish is my command. DA, send her in, Effie, send her in. Effie, the DA will see you, Miss Clemmings. Marge, Reno, did you tell her Bill sent me? Effie, Hillary, I told Reno Hillary sent you. This way, Miss Clemmings, this way. Marge, oh, thanks. To the audience, if you only knew. This time, I'll tell the truth. I think I really like about your plays and like the contrast of What Now What and Groove Bang. It's just like the facility of really different kind of writing styles. So I would like to ask you more about technique and poetic technique, creative technique.
Excuse me.
No worries. That you use for different types of writing.
Let me explain what happened. It's crazy. And now, because you and I were talking on the phone, and you want me to bring it up, and now I don't feel ashamed, and I will bring it up, is that after I lost my eyesight, I got frightened. I said, holy cow. I said, the only thing you like, Steve Canem, is you like to sit down and read. You love good poetry, you love good books, and luckily for you, you love good music, 'cause at least you can listen to music. But you're a writer. Now, how in the hell are you going to write being blind? And so all kinds of people was running up and down talking about, well, Steve, all you got to do is get a tape recorder and read something in a tape recorder, and then somebody can type up what you say. I say, you can't write that way. You have to think things out when you write. I'm one of these writers who think things out. So what I found is that my whole technique changed, Tracy, because what I started doing once I lost my eyesight is that instead of writing for the eye, I started writing directly for the ear. You follow? So meaning now I've been very focused more on the sound of language and the sound of the spoken word, because the only way I I get information about who this person is and who that person is by the sound of their voice and inflections and intonations and things like that. And so I have to imagine what people look like. So when I write nowadays, I usually dictate to this person or that person. And the beautiful thing about dictating to someone is that you can edit and change it on the scene. They just read the sentence back to you, read the page back to you, and you correct it. And all I'm doing is correcting it according to the sound. Whereas the groove bang Jive Around was written for the eye and the ear. Whereas this is the plays are written mostly for the eye, for the ear. But it was kind of frightening, but that's the only way I can write now. Because I dictate. It's all ear.
Wow.
I don't know if that's making sense to you or not.
It absolutely does. It actually refers back to the essay you did on David Hammond's, which was talking about other sensory perception like smells.
Yeah.
The reason I brought up you and your loss of sight as a possible topic is because you wrote about it in Essence magazine.
Oh yeah, I remember.
And that article really stuck with me because it was well written and was really poignant. The way that you you opened up so honestly and clearly about losing your sight. But also because you forced me to think about something, think about loss of sight in another way, which is generally when you talk about artists losing their sight. He said, especially when you're talking about black artists, you think about musicians. People don't talk about writers losing their sight. And that's a completely different context than the way we understand a Stevie Wonder or a Ray Charles.
Right.
What does it mean when somebody loses their sight who writes? And I was very moved to read that, and I was also very, very happy to see it in Essence magazine, that kind of conversation being brought up in that forum, which is at the time even more so black community vehicle. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. But it's very interesting because I think that it was fun being a participant in some of these plays that you had in these play readings that you had, stage readings at the Lower East Side in various spots. Was the economy of words is so freaking precise there. It's like there's so much space, but every word is really loaded. But they're not heavy words. It's very much related to intonation.
Yeah.
And also what's not said. It's what's said, but equally as important as what's not said.
Yeah. And where that comes from. That comes from just spending a lot of time listening to Monk because where he uses space. So I was trying to figure out how to use space similar to where those jazz musicians use space. And with some jazz buff told me a long time ago, I was in my 20s, and this goes back to Miles Davis. So I'm hanging out with this hipster. He's about 20 years older than me. And so we sitting down and listening to some music, and the guy turns to me, Tracy, he says, "You know what?" I said, "What?" He said, "When you listen to Miles Davis play, man," he said, "don't listen to what he's doing with his horn. Listen to the space between the horn." He said, "Don't listen to the solo. Listen to what happens after the solo, and think about what the solo meant. The silences, man, the silences." And I had never thought of that. So when I write now, I try to leave as much space as possible. Yeah.
Wow. That's really genius. I'm sorry. That's like. And I just love the way your I wouldn't say need to write, your writing self superseded the disability. We don't have to go into a whole long story. It's a very simple story.
Yeah.
And I want to mention it because it actually affected me. Steve lost his sight because he had undiagnosed glaucoma, and by the time it was diagnosed, it was too late to save his sight. And I don't know if you realized how that horrible situation for you really made people, made me pay attention to my sight and pay attention to it in ways that I generally hadn't. It's something that you take for granted.
Yeah.
And then you just, you say, okay, well, I've got to be fit or I've got to be healthy. I got to be able to walk and stuff like that. But it's like,
right.
I got to keep I got to maintain my sight. So since I've found that out about you, when I've gotten my eyesight checked, I always check for glaucoma, and I've done it for a very long time. It's like, because you never know. So thank you for that. I think you might have helped and saved a lot of people's sight by just being so open and honest about how you lost your sight. I know we got to take time for questions. So I guess the last part I want to ask you about is the Lower East Side after the 60s and 70s and when I came to know you, which is later Lower East Side. One of the great stories that I can tell you about Steve and how I got to know him besides the Stoop workshop and was when I was a slam poet many years ago. Many years ago. And Steve would sit by the end of the bar with his drink, you know, and make snide comments to the people who were earnestly trying to read their poems and connect with the audience. But he had such a spare, cutting analysis. I was like, you know, people pay a lot of money for that analysis. So I remember one time there was, and since Steve was, he drank more back then, you know, you hear this like older, no, you got people who live into their 90s, so yeah, you're just a spring chicken. But, you know, older people, older person drinking, sitting at the bar, so they're saying, rah, rah, you know. And people would dismiss Steve, especially some of the newer poets that come around, who's that guy? I don't know, he's just a guy at the bar. But he was always so precise with his critiques. And I remember this one poet was reading this like really excruciating slam poem, and I've written and read excruciating slam poems myself, thinking I was the thing. And then the person like read this poem, and everybody's like, "Wow!" And Steve waits for that perfect silence, you know, playing, and he says, "Thank you, Walt Whitman." And it was so messed up, you know? It was so rude, and everybody was just like. And I was just like, well, what does that mean? And it was just like, what he was saying was failed Walt Whitman wannabe.
Right.
You know? But he wasn't going to say failed Walt Whitman wannabe or really? Is that your idea of imagery or what is
Right.
So he just was like, thank you, Walt Whitman. And you kind of want to say, and the unspoken thing was, now go look them up. You know what I mean?
Right. Go and read something.
And you know, one of the great things about being a slam poet at that time, and one of the particular advantages of being a slam poet in New York, which people don't talk about enough, is we had people like that, like Steve and Miguel Algarin and these other people judging us.
Right.
You know, and making comments on us. It wasn't just like who connected with the audience best and who got the clap. It's like, you know, Miguel is like, I know all of Shakespeare's plays. I teach Shakespeare at Rutgers. I know what you're doing, and that's not working.
Right.
I don't care if you could say it in Spanish. You could say it. You could do all these little tricks that make people think that you're doing. It's like, but I've seen it. I do it. I know the classical stuff, European classical stuff. I know the hipster, bohemian, person of color stuff.
Right.
And no, just no. And it's the same thing with Steve. There's people who really had a different way of presenting criteria for excellence, and I was like, okay, I got to go workshop, and that's when I started going to workshops some more. But it wasn't in the conventional MFA program way. It was a different kind of vibe, and so when I got to Cave Canem, I felt very welcome. But when I was in my MFA program, I was incorrigible. I was just like, how come there's not more black poets? How come you guys only want to read like conventional poetry? My program was great, you know, but it was just, I had been really spoiled by having access to tribes and the Stoop and Cave Canem, and I was just like, what do you mean nobody here likes experimental writing? How is that possible? You know, what do you mean y'all don't know who Bob Kaufman is?
Right.
How is that possible? You know, so it made me very difficult. But boy, I was able to take a criticism and let it just roll off. Because, you know, I remember actually one time I was reading for, they had this special thing, and the great Gwendolyn Brooks came by, and they let a couple of us new poets at the time read some poems to Gwendolyn Brooks. So I was like, what? So I was ready, but of course I was like, I would just like to say that Miss Brooks, I'm so honored. You know, I would do this whole thing. I was terrified and honored and nervous at the same time, like absolutely knees shaking. And I was saying all these, you know, these accolades about her. And then Steve says at the end of the bar, read the goddamn poem. It just totally broke the spell of me like sinking into my obsequiousness. And I read the damn poem. And I think I read 1 or 2 poems, and a whole bunch of other people read 1 or 2 poems. And it was like, one of the things I took from it is like, it's about the work. It's about the work. And that's what it was for one of my books. It's like, it's about the work.
That's it.
If you're working on it, work on it. But
Right.
there's all the, slavish devotion and so spending the whole time talking about how great she is like everybody knows that already. So you ain't got to talk about that. Just read the work. And so I got back to the work. Still working on it.
One thing I wanted to say about that, what Tracy's leaving out, you see, because what happened with the New Yorker, and by the way, folks, one reason I started to gather the Tracie magazine is to document some of that damn good stuff that was coming out of the cafe, because I thought a lot of that stuff shouldn't be lost, it should be preserved. So I figured the easiest way to preserve it was to get in the magazine. So I've been living down that neighborhood, as you know, since 1962. So I certainly knew all the Puerto Rican poets and all the other poets that come in and out of there all those years. Older people my age and young people come in and out. Anyway, so when the cafe opened its doors, is that, I would go down, like Tracy said, and sit in the bar and listen to what the young folks are, reading, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes they have older poets come in and do reading. Baraka would come there and read from time to time. And, various other, older poets. Gwendolyn Brooks, like she said, came in and read. But what they would do, the young poets would be so naive, is that what they would do, they would get up there and tell a long story. I wrote this for my grandmother's sister, and I remember when I was a little boy, and go on and on with the story, and the story would be better than the damn poem. So when they bring out those stories, I was just shouting, read the poem. I don't want to hear the story. Where's the poem?
No. He was always saying, read the goddamn poem.
Right.
That was Steve's line. He's like editing for posterity or something, but that's what that was the Steve line. Read the goddamn poem. So yeah, there's the Lower East Side in the 90s. There's a lot of people that I met. Some of them have since passed.
Some good people came through that. Tracy is one of them. And y'all got a lot of them reading at that thing, including, Sarah Jones, that Cave Canem benefit. She started at the cafe 2 years ago.
A lot of people started
a lot
at the cafe.
of talent came to that place.
Mums in Aurora, Mums the Schemer came through the Lower East Side. I see David Henderson back there with his cap on. We were talking about you a little earlier, David. And
we talked about number already, David. You late.
No, David's been here for a while.
But, okay.
But we talked about you as soon as we started, so we talk about you some more. But it's really good to see you. David Henderson, John Farris, Julio Del Mar, classic.
And Tracy leaves something out. John Parrish used to come and try to play Steve Canon at the cafe, and McGowan everybody throw him out and talk about, you ain't Steve Canon.
It was very deep. Steve Canon is singular, and everybody tried to kind of be like this, like, no, you can't be like Steve Canon. But the other thing about Steve is his comments were cutting, but they were never mean-spirited. Like you said, Steve is a person who has a lot of joy. He laughs, and sometimes people would try to emulate his style of critique, but it would be discouragingly cruel, and you'd just be like, oh, go back.
It didn't work.
He was always encouraging with that, and continues to be. Butch Morris, who I came to know through your plays, and then eventually through his chorus of poets. Keith Roach, who I worked with at St. Mark's.
Right.
And some of the newer poets who came by either before me or was still hanging out when I was hanging out.
Yeah,
like Paul Beatty and Willie Perdomo and Norman Douglas.
Yeah, and don't forget, Tracy, the way I really got to know Sekou was through you guys. And of course, Sekou was teaching here at the time, but he and I got close. And what was a beautiful thing about him, every time I wanted to do a fundraiser for tribes, Sekou would get the phone call first and say, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, he never said no.
Yeah, I don't think I've been here since Sekou's passed. It feels very...
And you know how
Different to
many
be here.
millions of years ago, that was when you and Reggie Gaines got up and dragged me over
Oh,
here
yeah.
and read that. It must have had something to do with the skin I'm in. The skin I'm in. That poem is in the first issue of Times.
Yeah, the Stay Kusindiyada's wonderful Blink Your Eyes.
Yeah, right.
Reggie and I did a tribute or honoring Sekou. We co-performed that poem.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah, well, it's a great, great poem. It's very hard to mess up, that's for sure. Okay, well, it's impossible. Oh, I want to mention one more person before we go to questions. And that was the great Marcellus, who is a costume designer who worked on a lot of shows, a lot of costume performances in the Lower East Side and at the New Eurekan, who is one of these people that's just typical of the folks we used to hang out with. He made costumes for all kinds of performances, collaborated with Rome Neal. Very interested, very much part of the Harlem ball scene and queer culture. And hung out in the Lower East Side and was eclectic and funny and a great designer and was also a member of Mensa. And you just go, okay, how often do you get these kinds of combinations? But it was actually pretty common when I rolled through, and then I went back to Brooklyn where I belong, because, you know, I'm a hit when it gets down to it.
I'll be sitting at the bar at the end of the cafe, and so he'll come over and see me and sit there. And he started telling me stories about the gay world and his seed of the gay world, what the gay world was all about. And I'll be laughing so hard I couldn't even hear the poem. I said, man, you got to shut up. I'm trying to listen to this poem.
Yeah, he had some great stories. Very sweet man. Okay, well, I've probably gone over, but you can't, Steve, this is the surface. You can see this is just the surface. Right? But we'll open the floor to questions. Hopefully we'll get to some more of these details.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
All right, so if anyone has a question, just, all right, right over here.
Yeah, look, you touched a lot about Black Bohemia in the 60s, so that opens like a whole can of worms and stuff.
Yeah.
So I'll just go off the top of my head. Gil Scott-Heron, you know anything about him? You hang out with him? Is he a cool guy? He's really the only bridge between you guys and the generation of now hip-hop. He is the real father of hip-hop.
I got a funny story to tell you about Gil, which you probably get a big kick out of. Ishmael, when he published his first book, he started getting offers for teaching jobs here, teaching jobs there, teaching jobs elsewhere, and blah, blah, blah. And since seeing I was tight all the time, if he didn't want to take the job, he would say, hey, man, Steve, there's a job over here. They asked me, invite me to do this reading. Come with me to the reading, and I'll talk you up, and maybe they hire you, because I don't want that gig, because I want to be busy working on this next novel or essay or something whatever he's working on. So we went to Lincoln University to do. He did a reading, talked about leadership, blah blah blah. He introduced me to the dean of the department, told him who I was. I think I just published Group in Jive Around. I can't remember, but anyway, and the guy hired me on the spot. And guess who's one of my students? Gil. And guess who he's working on? The Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
Wow.
And it was funny as all hell. What they used to do, it was funny because I would go out there and teach. Now, I'd go out there on a Monday night, and the classes I had was one-on-one. It wasn't sitting in the classroom. I saw each student by themselves, read this stuff, and blah, blah, blah. And Gil decided he was too hip to come and hang out because, he was the man on campus, and he had this piano player with him, Brian, I think that guy's name was. And they didn't live in the campus. They lived in the, a trailer back on the side of the campus. So they'd drag me back to the side of the campus in a little trailer, light up a little joint, and all they want to know from me, hey, brother, you in New York, man, what's Miles doing? You saw John Coltrane lately? Have a car song, man. What's happening back in the city? Blah, blah, blah. Then we talk about, wanting to pick my brain about who was playing where in New York City. And then Gil would pull out his little poems and read his little poems to me. Hey, brother, I wrote this. What do you think about it? I say, okay, you want to hit on this joint? I'll read this to you, brother. Have a piece of this joint first. I'll take a little drag. Then he pulled out this little poem called The Revolution Might Be Televised. And he read it to me. So I'm sitting there, I'm trying to be Mr. Cool and stuff. He turns to me after, he said, what do you think about it, bro? You think it worked? Now, you know damn well I knew everything about the last poets. I heard the last poets 1,000 times. You knew all those guys who was part of the last poets. So I had been hearing that kind of stuff for years before, he came on the scene and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, so he read it to me. He said, what do you think? I said, man, he's edited. I said, take this out, leave this in, and take that out. And next thing I know, I get back to New York. Less than 6 months later, the damn thing's on the radio and he's famous.
Oh my God, the go-to fixer.
More questions?
Hi. I just wanted to tell you what a pleasure it was to hear you tonight, going down memory lane. And since my husband didn't want to ask, he went to school with Ishmael.
Huh?
Buffalo. University of Buffalo. And we were just interested, what is Ishmael doing today?
What is who?
Ishmael. Yeah, Ishmael.
Oh, Ishmael. He was just in town. I was just talking to him on the elevator with this guy, Harper, who mentioned Ishmael, is that he's retired. Finally. It took him 200,000 years to retire. I retired from teaching in 1989, but the reason I retired, well, I didn't stop teaching because, Tracy told me he was running that during the workshop, and I still teach people one-on-one nowadays. But anyway, Ishmael retired from University of California, finally at Berkeley, less than 4 years ago. And all he's doing now, he's dedicating his time to writing, He just finished a book on Barack. On Obama, the president. He wants me to have a book party for him. He got that book published up there in Canada. And he comes to New York about every other year. Not about every 6 months. He comes by, I see him all the time. I don't see him, I talk to him, I can't see him. But he's doing quite well, and he's busy working on, he just finished a book on, what's his name, on the prize fighter, what's his name? Muhammad Ali. Yeah, he did a book on Muhammad Ali. In fact, he just found a publisher for it because he told me that the other day. So, Ishmael is one of those writers who never stop, and he works on about 4 or 5, projects all at the same time.
Steve, you started Tribes, Gathering of the Tribes, 1990, 91 or so forth, your first magazine. What is to be the future of A Gathering of the Tribes, of Flight by Night, you're publishing as well? What at this point, too. And the gallery, and at this point, your legacy, what is to be the future of A Gathering of the Tribes?
Well, okay, Rod, let me answer the question a different kind of way. Like and Tracy know, is that the only reason I started that darn magazine, because so much good stuff was coming out of the cafe, and I was afraid a lot of that stuff was going to get missed. So I figured, and Gil Shook and I started the magazine, and the reason I started it was to capture and publish a lot of this stuff that's coming out. Subsequently, what came out of the magazine was that someone who showed me Nameless came over and intimidated me and insisted I publish a book by John Paris. That was the first book of poetry I tried to publish. And then from there, we certainly have published other writers, through the years. And
you published Carl Hancock Rux's first book, too.
Yeah, we did Carl Hancock Rux. That Carl Hancock Rux book went into 4 reprints. That book is just all like hell because Carl knows how to promote himself. And same thing with Cheryl Boyce Taylor. Her book went into 4 or 5 printings. But in answer to your question, the only thing I'm thinking seriously about, I was talking to someone about it yesterday, but I haven't made a decision yet, is I'm thinking about should I or shouldn't I start publishing ebooks. But I don't know what kind of market there is for that stuff. But I'm giving it some thought. So in answer to your question, we can continue to do the same thing we're doing. The only thing that might change, would probably be the format. I might start doing ebooks or something like that. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing the print form too,
Any more questions? If not, I would like to.
There's one more.
Oh, there's one more. Okay, great.
You've seen all these different movements. I don't think I need the microphone. Okay.
Well, they actually need to
What? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You've seen all these different movements, and like Umbra and the Black Arts movement, New Eurekan, gathering of tribes. How have things changed, if at all, and where do you see it going? And yeah.
You mean, has it changed a lot,
Yeah, has
Tom?
it been, like, you've seen all these different things happen, the trajectory of your life. Do you think it's changed much over the last 40 years? And
yeah, because I mean, each generation brings whatever they have to the table, and you certainly have an awful lot of talent out there, especially about young people. These people in their 20s and things like that. Compared to when Tracy was young and things like that. You'd be surprised at all the talent that's out there right now. You follow? But as far as art, like I went to see that show on abstract expressionism today, which is a couple of friends of mine, and the sad part about that show, and I don't know if you know about that movement in art, is that they only have 3 Afro-American painters in that show. Now, who's in that show is Norman Lewis, or Romare Bearden, and Richard Poinsett Dart, and that's it. Now, a lot of people on the scene don't realize during that period, you had Asian Americans who was doing abstract art, you had Hispanic Americans who was doing abstract art, and you certainly did have Native Americans doing abstract art. But that's being denied at the Museum of Modern Art. We did a show down at Tribes. Jack Tilton got David Hamilton to put together a show of Afro-American and Euro-American abstract expressionists. And I went to the opening, and Jack asked me what did I think about the show. I said, well, it's good. I said, but there's only one problem. He says, what? I said, because Tribes, is multicultural. We cover every damn body. We believe in diversity, and you're leaving other groups out. He said, well, I tell you what. He said, you put it together, and I'll finance it. So we did a show with 2 galleries, but we brought in the other artists, and a lot of people came to that show and didn't even know Native Americans did abstract expressionism. But I see, the way I think of Tribes is that, we in Israel, of the same spirit in a sense, is that you got a lot of gaps in American culture that's holes that still need to be filled up. A lot of misinformation and no information, and people don't know who did what. How many people in this room right now know that abstract expressionism was started by an artist by the name of Norman Lewis? Everybody thinks it's Jackson Pollock, and everyone knows it's been documented that Norman Lewis started that movement by himself. That's the kind of information, misinformation, all information I'm talking about. Barack talks about that all the time. You guys know that. Every time you hear Barack run his mouth, he starts talking about all the stuff that's being, all the holes that needs to be filled and all the misinformation that's out there. The same sort of thing that I'm trying to do,
Oh. We got 2 more.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions. I think we'll start with you back here, and then.
Hey, Steve, I was just thinking, there's the East Village and there's the Lower East Side, and you've been living in the East Village or Lower East Side for a long time. Maybe you can tell people the difference, because I know, like, you live on 3rd Street, near Avenue C, and there's Ken Kelleher House, there's the New Yorker is right there. Umber used to meet around the corner in 2nd and C.
How well I remember those days.
Right. So could you tell people the difference? Because, I know that Avenue D, the Lower East Side, is different from the East Village, and a lot of people think that, that's the East Village you live in, but you live in a distinct part of that whole area. And I don't know, maybe you can wax on it for a minute.
Well, the only thing, the way I think about it, David, you got to remember, I met you in Israel way back there down in 1962. I always think of that damn neighborhood still at the Lower East Side. I don't even think of it, East Village and all that real estate bullshit and all that ABC, Alphabet City and all that crazy stuff. It doesn't mean anything to me, because that neighborhood has a history, Black folks moved to that neighborhood, David, way back before the Civil War. That house I'm in was built in 1847. And, you've always had Afro-Americans down there, not the ones who are down there now. Most of those people came in from the South, but I'm talking about historically. They were down there, way back, going back to the African burial ground and all that kind of stuff when that area was populated. Tompkins Square Park was a cemetery, that. They finally turned it into a park years later. They used to, use that as a cemetery. But I just think of that whole thing. Now, who was living over that time? Dorothy White used to live over there. What's his name? I was thinking about the guy who used to play with Arnett, the trumpet player, the little pocket trumpet player. What's his name? You know what I'm thinking of. Don Cherry wrote a tune called Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, Avenue D, Avenue A, Avenue C, and he really did a little tune before it. David Hammond's got a copy of that record, and you know, and Sunrise Orchestra played at Slugs for years. He used to come out there and play in front of the place, and you know all about it. And I had Sunrise play over there in my neighborhood. But you got some hip shit that's happening right there on Avenue C, all up and down that street nowadays. You know, all kinds of little clubs and little places. And Norman told me some sad story this morning. He got that little club over there on 5C. It's closing down, and that's sad. You know, and luckily the cafe is still there, so you got that stuff happening over there. But I don't think of where St. Mark's Church is, 3rd Avenue, and all the way over there where I'm in. I don't think of it as different. I just think of all that as one big community, that's all. And they all communicate with each other, ABC Noria, New York, St. Mark's Church, the Bowery Poetry Club, you know, all those places. All those people talk to each other all the time, and they use each other's spaces to do what the hell they want to do, you know.
I know you're busy all the time, and you kind of radiate from your seat on the couch. But what would you be thinking about now? Are you writing anything? Thinking about writing?
Yeah, I'm you know, what happens to me right now, for the most part, is that I do a lot of writing on assignment. Now, what I mean by that, someone would call me up and say, hey, I need you to write something on this, I need you to write something on that, I read you something on that. And then occasionally, you know, someone would call me up and ask me to, you know, read in public. And I'm trying to figure out how in the hell does a blind guy read in public. I certainly can't see a piece of paper. But anyway, so usually when I get that note, I usually tell a person yes or no. And the way I do it, you know, I just think about, you know, a subject and a poem. And the way I write a poem in my head, the only thing that's beautiful about that nowadays, it's just like when Tracy was asking me earlier about how to write now until I dictate. But the way it's done, the only thing I have to do is think of the structure. It's structure. Once I have the structure, then I know what the words are to follow the structure. So what I'm doing now, I'm working on some poems, and I'm thinking about writing another play, but I haven't figured out the structure of it yet. But I know it's going to be all this crazy stuff that's going on with the Tea Party, because I think those people are really a bunch of buffoons.
Yeah, we won't get an argument.
Okay. What was the relationship with the brothers in relationship to the beat poets like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg?
Well, let me tell
you. Was there any conflict?
Let me tell you, and who could do a better job of telling this story is David. When Umber put out its first issue, and everybody got all excited about what Umber was doing. Keep in mind, we all knew each other because we were all down on the Lower East Side. Al and that whole crowd got so excited about who in hell was Umber and what Umber was doing, they made sure to get over there and become nosy about what David O'Keefe was doing. So we would see each other all the time. And Alan certainly had given me money before he died, God bless his soul, to keep our tribes alive. In fact, one of the last conversations I had with Alan, I feel embarrassed telling you this story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. I called him Alan, and I said, say man, I need some money for tries. He said, what do you need it for? I said, I need money to bring out the next issue. And Alan says to me on the phone, he said, don't tell anyone, Steve. He said, but a lot of that stuff that's passed for poetry out there now is a lot of bluster, you know. No, that was a relationship. We would see each other all the time. And who Alan was really crazy about in terms of Umber poets, who was a dear friend of David and Ishmael, and I met that guy through David and Ish, was Lorenzo Thomas. You know, that guy, Alan held that guy in high esteem. We would see, in fact, we had a friend of ours by the name of Calvin Hicks. And Calvin put together a reading at Columbia University to help the poor people on the Lower East Side who's being chased out of their apartments because they didn't get any heat and they're filled with rats and roaches and all that kind of stuff. And he did a fundraiser for those poor people on it and got all the poets to read at Columbia University, got me to MC the reading. And then they did the same reading down at Judson Church, got me to MC the reading. And I'm sitting in the place that's full with all these people are sitting on the floor all over the place. I got on the mic and say, well, those who are supposed to read come to the stage. The whole audience came up. I said, wait a minute, not all you guys. And Alan ran up to me because there's about 20 boys who are going to read. Alan ran to me, he says, man, let me read first. I said, wait a minute, Alan. I said, read first. I got about 5 minutes. I don't know if I can let you read first. You only got a certain amount of time. He said, yeah, man. He says, Jesse Shea comes in the office, in the audience. I said, oh, he went to a Russian poet. Bobby Kennedy had invited him to the United States. And I said, what you going to read? He said, I'm going to read Hall. Oh, God. That took about half an hour. But they would see each other all the time. In fact, when Baraka got into trouble, I was thinking about Baraka the other day. We got beat up over there in Newark during the riots over there. The cops beat the pistol whip Baraka and put his butt in the hospital, all that kind of stuff. We did a big fundraiser for Baraka at Judson Church, and it was all the white and black poets, everybody, male and female. Raise some money, help him, But they would see each other all the time. There was no separation.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up. I hope that you'll join us for refreshments. And I just want to say a thank you one more time to Tracie Morris and Steve Canem for that wonderful conversation.